I want to talk about some new information that has been uncovered by the America First Legal and shared with the Washington Free Beacon. But before I get to that, I want to talk about the meaning of censorship. The meaning of censorship in a legal sense is not merely the idea that you have a right to speak, and if somebody prevents you from speaking, they are undermining your First Amendment free speech rights. No. Let's say, for example, you come over to my house and I say, obviously arbitrarily, you cannot recite the Declaration of Independence while you're on my property. You can't do it in my yard, or you can't do it inside my house. Am I violating the First Amendment? And the answer is no. Why? Because I'm a private individual, and this would also, by the way, apply to private companies. Private companies are allowed to set their own standards for what kind of speech they use or don't use. And you can see where I'm going with this. These private companies, in theory, can be even large companies. They can be companies like Ford Motor Company, or even Twitter or Facebook. By themselves, it would seem, they are not covered by the First Amendment. Why? Because the First Amendment says, and just the actual language of it, Congress shall make no law. In fact, a number of the Bill of Rights begin, Congress shall make no law restricting freedom of speech or of the press. Now, Congress here is interpreted a little more broadly than just Congress. It means the U.S. government. The U.S. government cannot restrict speech. Again, by extension, this is a complicated issue, but we won't go into it. It applies also to the states. The states are also, after all, government. And there's a doctrine in constitutional law called incorporation, in which the limitations applied to the federal government are held by courts to also apply to the states. But putting that to the side, the issue here is that government can't restrict free speech, but private actors can. Now, this is what makes these latest discoveries I'm about to talk about so significant. What America First has been able to do is uncover communication between the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, and all these social media companies. Social media companies like Twitter, like Facebook, like YouTube and Google. And what you see is that there is a continuous traffic of information back and forth between a governmental agency, which is, by the way, covered by the First Amendment, and these social media platforms. And what is the government agency doing, the CDC? It's sending the names and posts, specific posts, of people to be flagged or to have them deplatformed or to have them banned. So this is, I would say, coming very close to the smoking gun we're looking for. Why? Because if a government agency is using its leverage or using its power with social media companies to restrict others, then the social media companies are not acting solely on their own. They're not merely private actors restricting speech. They are, in fact, private actors operating through constant collusion with the government. In other words, they are now covered by the First Amendment. Why? Because it isn't just the private actor doing it. It's the private actor doing it at the behest, at the instruction, at the dictation of the federal government. We see regular chats and communications between the CDC and these tech agencies. We see high levels of coordination between the government and the tech industry. So, in a sense, you remember when Biden wanted to set up his, quote, disinformation board, and there was a public outcry, and the woman that he appointed to do this turned out to be an absolute dunce. I mean, kind of a former, an aspiring dancer and yoga instructor is now in charge of classifying disinformation in the United States. Well, anyway, all of that came to dust, all of that blew up, and the Biden administration doesn't really have that disinformation board, but notice that in a way they do. Why? Because they're operating through these tech platforms. They're operating through supposedly private platforms to achieve their will. And we know that multiple government agencies are attempting this, but we know that the CDC is actually doing it. In fact, one email shows that a senior CDC official appears anonymously without giving the name at a Google 2020 Trusted Media Summit. So Google has a summit. Who's supposed to be at the summit? Well, according to the website, it's for, quote, journalists, fact checkers, educators, researchers, others who work in the area of fact-checking, verification, media literacy, and fighting misinformation. So, interesting, this is a private conglomeration of people who work in the so-called disinformation industry. They obviously mean misinformation. Disinformation really is information that comes from a foreign government. The Russian government is doing disinformation. The Chinese are doing disinformation. You and I can't really do disinformation. We can put out information that's not true. That would be misinformation. But the point here is that the CDC shows up at this private event. Why? Because there is obviously a behind-the-scenes concert or collaboration between the government and these private entities. So I think all of this means, there's also, by the way, a little tidbit here, Facebook is awarding the CDC with, quote, millions of dollars in ad credits, which means the CDC can use Facebook for its propaganda, and it's free. They don't have to pay Facebook. So again, this is a further sign of the government and the private sector working together to suppress free speech. I think all of this means is that if you or I are thrown off Facebook and we're able to show that this was at the direction of the CDC or some government agency, we are in very strong First Amendment territory. And if we can help our case to move up the ranks to the Supreme Court, we might find the kind of resounding victory that we need that would once and for all put all these tech platforms on notice that they can't be propaganda vehicles for the U.S. government.